Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're taking on the issue of organ transplants and scarce medical resources. This lecture has an additional bit of oomph to it given the present COVID-19 issue tearing through the nation and globally. As always with biomedical issues, we are using the Intervention and Reflection textbook, this time Chapter 8. So let's get to it. With the advancement of medical science, and especially in terms of transplants, we are reaching an age where we have started looking at the human body as little different than any other machine, namely a complex system composed of interchangeable parts. This is the sort of utopian-dystopian goal, depending on where you fall on the issue. The promise of a body completely separated from our sense of self is both discombobulating and highly attractive. Don't worry about that liver, we'll print you a better one. A hole in the heart? No sweat, we got a new model in last week, you'll love it. Though our book fails to mention it, the same process of transplants has absolutely no reason to stop at organic transplants. In fact, with the certainty of standards provided by technology, who would not want to have some mechanical replacements, and for fun make them cybernetic? Maybe adjust your knee performance for better shock absorption to make running easier. Future aside, the amazing advancement in preventing transplant rejection have made transplants more and more viable, and oftentimes a necessary medical procedure for millions of people worldwide. Here our focus will be on a few related factors: funds, resources and their availability, and social restriction and distribution, especially where we are dealing with issues like permanent shortages. The following questions are raised by the fact that transplants are both necessary and scarce. 1. Who speaks for the allocation? 2. Do we judge potential recipients on some kind of a standard, maybe on the basis of their behavioral or medical risks, maybe on their social contribution? 3. Who gets to adjudicate? With some 500,000 dialysis patients in the U.S., the cost listed by our book for their annual treatment stands at about $50 billion. And why is it that dialysis is the only federally funded program regarding organ failure? And why are we, the taxpayers, subsidizing such an expensive treatment, given that the annual education budget for the entire country is $60 billion? Because of the cost, doctors are the ones to decide whether they will refer a patient for dialysis on the basis of features like likelihood to attend, likelihood to alter their behavioral patterns to make the dialysis mean something more in the long run, and so on. Fact of the matter is that unless we go completely to a mechanical transplant system, transplants are going to remain a scarce commodity. That is, the demand will always be greater than the supply. And that means that some people who need the transplants will not be able to get them. Perhaps because they're poor, perhaps because of other features. But we as a society are forced to determine who should get them, or to put it more bluntly, who gets to die because they don't get them. And this is not just an issue for transplant organs. All scarce medical resources inherently work the same way. With the present COVID-19 crisis, we're running out of respirators. That means the doctors have to decide who gets one, who might live, and who does not, and will get to die. And the doctors and hospitals can be sued, which means that we can't pretend that it's just up to them. We, as a society, have to make these calls in order to allow the doctors to do their jobs. We'll see that any potential treatment or vaccine will hit the exact same problem as well, at least initially. So, we're ultimately faced with the following problem. When the demand outpaces the supply for a product necessary to live, we are forced to answer the question, who gets sacrificed? So, how do our prospective ethical theories answer the question of sacrifice? Utilitarians are going to make this decision on the basis of utility, no surprise there. Depending on the specific perspective, that utility might be something like saving the most people, or saving people with most social worth, or saving people most likely to contribute to ending a crisis, for example, the people making vaccines or organ donors. According to the text, another approach utilitarians might be okay with is the idea of a random lottery to simplify the process. However, I don't really see that as a particularly viable option, not when you can at least reduce the potential pool by first removing certain people with minimal utility, say a patient who needs a kidney but also has incurable and malignant metastasized pancreatic cancer. Sure, they can get the kidney, but they'll drop dead in a year and you can't use any of their organs, even if they are a donor. Thus, I personally see the most likely utilitarian option as saving those with the highest chance of actually being saved. This approach gets you the most bang for your buck, the highest happiness for the least cost, and that lower cost per patient allows you to treat more patients. Kantian ethics are not able to make any kind of decision for allocation. Since all people have the absolute same value, you can't use a contextual feature to make a preferential call in favor of one over the other. So the call is that unless you can do something for everyone, you can't do anything for anyone. Not a very good way of supporting their humanity, eh? One way around the problem is to take the preferential part out of the equation by turning the system into a lottery. With a random system, everyone has the same chance of getting picked, and so everyone's humanity is recognized, even if only a select few get the treatment. Ross would argue that we have the obligation to preserve our lives and the lives of others, so a call must be made. That is, the Kantian do-nothing option is not an option. But the way of making that call is possible only on the basis of the lottery, without dehumanizing people. Additionally, while there is a risk to participating in the lottery, there's nothing inherently wrong with taking risks, and certainly not when they're in service to some moral good, like preservation of life. Natural law has more or less the same position as Ross. Rawls would argue that the allocation is necessary, but it can't be based on social worth, as that disproportionately affects the vast majority of the global population who are, in fact, poor. Thus, that would devolve into something like save the rich. Instead, Rawls would argue that the allocation needs to actually privilege people who are otherwise worse off in order to correct for social and economic imbalances. On to our articles. The article by Janet Radcliffe-Richards argues for the permissibility of kidney sales, and she builds that argument as follows. Dialysis is a scarce resource, and the lack of kidney donors leads to increased suffering and death. But we don't allow people to sell kidneys openly because it's seen as a moral evil. However, the reason why we feel that is ultimately indefensible. Thus, let the kidney sales begin. So why is it supposedly wrong to sell a kidney? One, it is the exploitation of people who are too broke to have other good options, and who are too incompetent to properly understand consent. But she says this is a bad argument. One, if the potential kidney sellers are too broke to have an option, then by banning kidney sales, we're taking away their best option for getting out of poverty. And two, if they're too incompetent to understand and consent, well then get them some education on the issue, or do what we do for anyone else in that position who's donating an organ, assign them a proxy to speak on their behalf. But neither of these are good arguments against kidney sales. The only difference between people donating a kidney and those selling it is the payment. It's not like the people donating their kidney are all magically in a great economic state, nor are they magically better educated. So, since it's likely to be roughly the same population anyway, the problems of sellers are the same as the problems of donators, and we don't complain about people donating their kidneys. Additionally, in terms of the risky nature of surgeries, of likelihood of being taken advantage of misusing money gained by the sale, the same population takes far greater and more consistent risks, and the same iffy behavior is far more prevalent in the rest of their lives. No one becomes a coal miner because it's fun. It's a deadly, dangerous occupation filled with hazards, with rampant substance abuse, exploitative businesses in the community, and so forth. But no one seems to want to jump in and prevent that. So if you can choose to be a coal miner, you can choose to be a kidney seller. Next, banning the sales would just make the would-be sellers and potential recipients worse off. You can still get underground black market sales, which are not carried out with the best medical practices. Yes, the rich have more privileges than the poor, but that extends to everything else, including the rest of the healthcare issues and the ability to live in safe places and so on. Unless your complaint is aimed at redressing all that, it's not really clear why the line is magically drawn here. But what about altruism? Donating organs should be an altruistic experience, not selling someone the ability to survive for profit. But she asks the question, why can you be altruistic by donating a kidney to your friend so they can live, but you can't be altruistic by selling your kidney to buy something else that they need to live? Also, we don't normally ban useful behavior that doesn't happen to be altruistic. and therefore, she says, kidney sales should be regulated and not banned. I want to take a moment to draw your attention to some problems here. Radcliffe-Richards is using a utilitarian approach, but one heavily influenced with a sort of political realism. Rather than arguing the morality of the issue, she's arguing for the fact that the situation simply is a certain way, never mind whether that's good or bad, or whether it should be changed, and what it means for our behavior to keep feeding into and propagating the existing system. The following argument used to be the staple of religious ethics. If an activity is prohibited to you, the believer, it is also prohibited to incentivize that same prohibited behavior in others by supporting it. So if you can't murder people, you also can't pay assassins to murder people for you. And that's because you're feeding into the problem and increasing the evil in the world, instead of acting to reduce it. In a closer-to-home example, it is incoherent to complain about illegal immigrants coming to work in this country while simultaneously choosing to hire those same illegal immigrants because they happen to be a cheaper workforce. You're literally taking something you consider to be a moral evil, something that should be prevented, and you're making it worse while complaining about how bad it is. Notice also that you can take the banning it makes it worse argument and apply it to banning cocaine, crack, heroin, fentanyl, and so on. The if you're not fixing everything, then you can't complain about this argument is equally flawed. The situation might be bad, but that's no reason to potentially make it worse. Does anyone realistically think that crime lords run favelas would not suddenly produce a whole lot of kidney sellers whose profits would go straight to those crime lords? That the same would not happen the world over and feed the worst elements of our society? Instead of recognition of deep social problems of the kinds of poverty that make giving up an organ your best option and then striving to fix that poverty, Radcliffe-Richards takes the approach that boils down to, well, if you're not useful for anything else, might as well get a kidney out of you. To her credit, this is exactly the kind of utilitarian reading of the situation that actually makes sense. There's no attempt to sugarcoat it, no attempt to appeal to human rights, which utilitarianism rejects anyway. Just a solid calculation treating humans as a means to move the happiness index in the right direction. Finally, Emanuel and Wertheimer argue that the distribution of scarce pandemic vaccines should privilege not the old, but the 13 to 40 age group, as well as the health and vaccine-related people. This reading is perhaps the most pertinent at the moment, given the COVID-19 situation. Not only does it raise some really good ethical questions, it also lays out the kinds of capacities that we have for dealing with the problem and the options available to us in allocation. While they are focused on the vaccine side of things, we should note that in a COVID-19 situation, the exact same issue arises for all the rest of the medical equipment. Safety equipment like masks and sanitizers, health equipment like respirators and hospital beds, limited resources like the time a doctor can work on you when another 500,000 people need immediate help too. Their starting point is the NVAC ACIP recommendation that the influenza vaccine be distributed to vaccine makers, health providers, and then the 65 and older age group. This call is made in order to decrease health impacts and severe morbidity and death, and to minimize the social and economic impacts. Now, this is a flu vaccine issue, but the situation is only more problematic for COVID-19 since we don't have a basis for vaccine development. Here is the timeline response to the pandemic setup Emanuel and Wertheimer provide. 1. Best case, from the start of a pandemic, the vaccine manufacture is 4 months. 2. The global production capacity for vaccines is roughly 500,000 a year annually. This is 2006. Thus, in the first year, 90% of the U.S. vaccination will not get vaccinated. And therefore, the distribution must be aimed at priority groups. The question is then, who should be the priority group? Should we prioritize by risk, the old and young, the middle-aged? The answer seems uncertain, and there are a number of competing theories for prioritization. One option is save most lives. Another option is women and children first. Then there is first come, first served. Save most quality years. Save those worst off. Save those by reciprocity, those who are giving back by being donors, and so forth. Save those most likely to fully recover. save those instrumental to make society flourish. The NVAC ACIP recommendation is geared towards maximizing life-saving utility first, vaccine makers and healthcare workers, and then saving most lives, that is, protecting the people at highest risk. Emanuel and Wertheimer argued that this is a bad idea. Why? Well, to save most lives is an urgent mode, right? No time to think. But we do in fact have time to think, because the pandemic is not upon us yet. Well, this one is, but without a vaccine, we can at least start thinking about the allocation now. You see, going by life cycle is a deliberative approach, and it focuses on patients who will have the most opportunity, who are most likely to reach old age. This matters because the tragedy of early death, they say, is failure to develop through all the life cycles. The more life cycles you can get, the better the outcome. Yes, there is a preference here, but it is an egalitarian one. It's not based on your contribution to society. The pure version would argue to protect whoever is the youngest, as they have the most cycles ahead of them. But the version they're arguing for is the investment version, which they argue is better. And instead of looking at the specific age, it looks at the gradations of lifespan. So infants are all one category, elderly are all one category, right? You don't try to adjudicate by the birth date specifically. And what we do is we show preference for one's achieved development of interest. And so the 13 to 40 age group is the best candidate for treatment, since they have developed enough to have developed interests, unlike infants, and they still have life cycles to go through, unlike the elderly. Besides the preferential focus, Emanuel and Wertheimer also focus on public order, things like safety and provision of necessities, as well as health workers and vaccine makers. This way, the remaining society is the least negatively affected as it comes out of the pandemic. So let's take a look at this one. For COVID purposes, I would like to draw your attention to a few facts noted here. Even for influenza, which we are very familiar with and generally know how to deal with to develop a new vaccine, the time between first infection and vaccine is 4 months. For things like COVID-19, where we don't know what we're dealing with, that time is projected to be 12 to 18 months. Now let's assume that since the article came out in 2006, our vaccine making capacity has quadrupled. It's not a good bet since nothing else seems to be going right, but let's go ahead and make that assumption. That means that we can make around 2 million vaccines per year. And that still means that we're at roughly 80% plus of U.S. population not getting vaccinated in the first year. So the question of distribution becomes critical. At the moment, as a country, we have taken the approach of financial stability of the country as taking precedence over survival. And perhaps this is justified because if the financial system collapses, so does the U.S. in all meaningful ways. And then the world takes a pretty bad hit as well, destroying states and lives around the globe. But that means that we are introducing another variable into the equation. Who is going to be additionally exposed to the threat by going back to work, and what do we do with them? Do we prioritize the health of people we're exposing to additional risk but who are not involved in vaccine production or healthcare industry? Is that where our scarce medical resources go? Do those people get dibs on respirators if they get sick? Are we going to prioritize grocery store workers over lawyers? Unlikely. And that's not because the grocery store workers are not essential. It's because even though their labor is essential, the skill set necessary to do the job makes them easily replaceable. Besides that ugly bit of calculus, we also have to ask questions of other prioritizations. For example, do we save the 3-year-old child, or do we save its mother, who has another 3 children? That is it better to save the mother, whose responsibilities or developments of interests are significantly higher, and whose survival continues to support additional people who would otherwise become a social responsibility of the state? Do we treat everyone the same, or do we take the people most likely to help rebuild after the pandemic and preserve them first? If we do, does that mean that we value some lives more than others? Or can we take functionality into account, given that we can't actually save everyone? If we could, then everyone would be saved. But we can't, so why not make the outcome as minimally painful as possible? Are we not already doing something like that when we prioritize vaccine makers and healthcare professionals? Are we not giving them greater value because of their functional contribution? We don't think of them as morally better, but is the doctor treating people and keeping the population alive more functionally valuable and worthy of saving than a random homeless person whose mental illness makes them a danger to themselves and everyone around them? Can we look at that comparison and pick the doctor to save without that decision being immoral? The people who became ill through sheer negligence, like the spring breakers partying it up in Florida after being told not to congregate, can we not give them treatment, at least if it is between them and a person that they infected through their stupid acts? Can we prefer the victim to the criminal in this case? If so, can we prefer innocent people to all criminals? So prisons don't get respirators, at least not unless we don't need them elsewhere. But then, what about the innocent people in jail? As you can see, this all gets very ugly, and it stays there. At the same time, we've been forced to start answering these questions right now, because the scarcity of resources is upon us right now. The weakness of our response as a state and globally means that we have not adequately answered these questions when we had the luxury of time to do so. If we had, we would have had a plan, a procedure, and understanding of how things work. Instead, we're groping about blindly and making things worse. That concludes our lecture. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below or shoot me an email. Thank you.